The Harrington Grand was the kind of hotel that made ordinary people feel like they'd been dressed in the wrong century. Its chandeliers dripped crystal the size of ice cubes. Its marble floors had been polished to a mirror finish that reflected the hemlines of gowns most guests had bought specifically for tonight. The foundation gala for the Whitmore Children's Medical Research Fund was, as the invitations promised, the event of the autumn season in the city, and everyone who attended knew their presence meant something. It meant they had money, or connections, or both. Vivienne Calloway stood near the east wall of the grand ballroom and counted the minutes by watching the champagne flutes move. She had been watching them for 40 minutes now, the same circuit from the silver trays carried by men in white gloves to the manicured hands of women laughing at things that weren't quite funny enough to laugh at, to the mouths mid-sentence about hedge funds and renovation projects, and children attending schools with names that sounded like British nobility. She had counted 17 flutes. She had spoken to no one. She wasn't sure why she had come. She had told herself it was because Patricia, her college roommate, now married into the Whitmore family, had practically begged her, "It'll be good for you, Viv. Get out of that apartment. You've been disappearing again." So here she was, not disappearing, just being invisible in a room full of people, which Patricia probably hadn't considered was basically the same thing. Vivienne was 29 years old. She had pale skin, the palest possible, colorless as winter sky, and hair the color of old silver, not dyed, not styled into anything fashionable, just long and straight, and white as the inside of a birch tree. Her eyes were a very pale gray with the faintest ring of pink at the iris, a product of her albinism, which made her pupils look slightly different in certain light, which made certain people uncomfortable in ways they never quite articulated, but which she had learned to read immediately. There was a half-second delay, a widening, then either the quick look away or worse, the sustained stare of someone trying to figure out what was wrong with her. She was wearing a dark green dress. She had learned that dark colors helped, somehow, created contrast and small pearl earrings, and she had put her hair up so it looked intentional rather than ghostly. She had done everything a person was supposed to do to look assembled, presentable, normal. She had spent 40 minutes that afternoon choosing the earrings alone, pearl versus garnet, understated versus invisible, the constant low calculation of someone who had learned that first impressions were harder to rewrite when your appearance gave people permission to decide things before you spoke. She had chosen the pearls because they were small and quiet and would not add to anyone's assessment. And still, a man across the room leaned close to his wife and said something. The wife's gaze slid sideways toward Vivienne, and she smiled in the contained, polished way of someone concealing a reaction she found amusing. Vivienne looked down at her phone. There were no new messages. She pulled up her email and stared at it without reading anything. 3 women passed her table. She heard one of them say, quietly, but not quietly enough, "She looks like she walked out of a horror film." Another replied, "Don't stare, Claire, it's rude." Which was interesting, Vivienne thought, because Claire had just stared directly at her while saying it was rude to stare. She set down her phone. She looked at the ballroom at the lights that were warm and golden, and that turned everyone's skin to something radiant, and she felt the old familiar feeling, the one that had no precise name. Not sadness. Not quite. It was more like the specific loneliness of being in a room full of people who could see you, and were choosing, collectively, not to. She had felt it first at age 7, in a classroom in rural Connecticut, when every child in 2nd grade picked a partner for the science fair, except her. She had felt it at 14, at the first school dance she attended, standing against the gymnasium wall for 2 full hours, while a DJ played music she didn't really like anyway. She had felt it at 23, in the restaurant where her boyfriend of 8 months had told her, very carefully, that it was just difficult sometimes to go places with her because people looked and he didn't always know how to handle that. She had felt it in the parking lot afterward, and in her car. And then, for about 3 weeks in her apartment. And then, she had decided to stop measuring loneliness in units of time and just accept it as weather. Something that came, something that changed, something you could not prevent. She reached for her glass and found it empty. A server was passing. She raised her hand slightly to indicate she'd like another. He walked past her without stopping. She lowered her hand. In the corner near the second set of double doors, a little girl in a cream-colored dress tugged on her father's jacket and pointed. His name was Thomas Hadley. He was 36, lean in the way of men who didn't think much about their physique, but had spent years doing physical work. He had been a contractor for 12 years before pivoting to something no one at this party would have expected, and he was wearing a navy suit that was well cut, but clearly not new. His shoes were polished. His tie was straight. He had tried, in the specific way that people try when they don't usually bother, but understand that tonight matters for reasons beyond themselves. His daughter, Rosie, was 6 years old and convinced that parties were basically the best thing that existed in the world, right behind dinosaurs and pancakes, and the particular shade of purple she used for sunsets in her drawings. "Daddy," Rosie said, tugging his jacket sleeve with the focused energy of a child who had been sitting still for 45 minutes and was nearing her absolute limit. "Daddy, why is everyone ignoring her?" Thomas had been watching it too. He wasn't the kind of man who observed without feeling. He had learned early that watching without caring was a skill some people cultivated like a muscle, and he had never wanted it. He watched the woman at the east wall, pale hair, dark green dress, phone she wasn't reading, and he felt the particular discomfort of someone who recognizes a feeling in another person, because he has lived inside it himself. "Come on," he said to Rosie. He picked up 2 cups of punch from the nearest refreshment table. He walked across the ballroom. He was aware that people noticed the crossing. It was the kind of room where movement with purpose attracted attention, where a man walking directly toward the isolated woman at the east wall was legible as either a scene about to happen or a story about to begin. A few heads turned. A few conversations paused. He kept walking. He reached her table. "Mind if I sit here?" Vivienne looked up from her phone, the empty screen she had been pretending to read for the last 10 minutes, and found a man standing before her with 2 cups of red punch and an expression that was neither pitying nor performatively kind. Just direct. Just asking. She blinked. She had been at this party for 47 minutes, and this was the first time anyone had spoken to her with the expectation of a real reply. "Sure," she said. He sat down. He placed 1 cup in front of her, kept one for himself. "Thomas," he said, "and this is Rosie." Rosie had already climbed into the chair beside Vivienne with the decisive confidence of a 6-year-old who has identified a priority. She looked at Vivienne with large, honest eyes, the kind of look that children give when they are genuinely looking, not performing an assessment, and then she said, with absolute seriousness, "Your hair looks like moonlight." Something in Vivienne's chest moved. She had been described many ways over the course of her life. Ghost. Creepy. Weird. Albino. Said as though it were an accusation. Once, memorably, interesting-looking, which was somehow worse than most of the others. But moonlight. She had never been moonlight. "Thank you," she said. And her voice came out smaller than she intended. Rosie nodded with satisfaction, as though she had completed an important task, and reached for her cup of punch. Thomas watched the exchange with the neutral calm of a man who was used to his daughter being right about things. "She's perceptive," he said simply. "I stopped arguing with her assessments about a year ago." "Good policy," Vivienne said. And then unexpectedly, almost against her will, she laughed. A small laugh, quiet but real. From across the room, a group of 3 women in cocktail dresses watched the exchange with expressions that settled somewhere between confusion and amusement. One of them tall, in a champagne gown, with the specific posture of someone who had been very beautiful for long enough to treat it as a career, leaned toward her companion and murmured something. Her companion smiled in a thin way. A man nearby said, loud enough to reach the adjacent tables, "Guess lonely people always find each other." Thomas heard it. He turned his cup in his hands once, slowly, and did not respond. He turned back to Vivienne instead, as though the comment had not been worth the interruption. Vivienne had heard it too. She was used to that, but she was watching Thomas, watching the way he did not react, not from weakness, not from oblivion, but from some deliberate choice she couldn't yet name. and something about it made her feel safer than she had felt in the previous hour. The MC's voice crackled through the room's speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be moving shortly to our evening program, which includes a very special announcement from the gala's lead benefactor, who has asked to remain anonymous until this evening. Please find your seats. The ballroom buzzed. Vivian glanced at Thomas. He was looking at Rosie, who had put her chin in both her hands and was watching the stage with the expression of someone who has decided that whatever comes next will probably be excellent. Do you do this often? Thomas asked. The gala circuit? No, Vivian said. My friend Patricia Whitmore, she sort of required my presence. You? I was asked to attend, he said. I don't usually go to things like this. Neither do I. She turned her cup. I can usually manage about an hour before I start doing inventory of the exits. 40 minutes for me, tonight, he said. We might have to race. She smiled. And it was a real smile, which used different muscles than the polite arrangement she'd been wearing since she arrived. Can I ask, does it bother Rosie? The way people... She stopped. Look at you, he finished. She nodded. She doesn't understand it yet, he said. She's 6. She just sees what's actually there. He paused. It bothers me more than it bothers her. There was something in the way he said it, not with heat, not performing anger on her behalf, just stating something plainly, the way you'd state a fact about weather that made her look at him more carefully. She said before she could stop herself. People have been staring at me since I was a child. Like I'm something that doesn't quite belong in the room. I've gotten used to the staring. It's the deciding to ignore me that's harder. He didn't say I understand or I'm sorry or that must be so difficult. All the responses people gave when they were handling a conversation they didn't know what to do with. He just listened. Fully. The way people listened when they weren't already preparing what to say next. When I was in high school, she said, because the listening had opened something, and she found she didn't want to close it. I had a teacher who was well-meaning. Genuinely well-meaning. She would always make sure to include me in class discussions, call on me when my hand wasn't up, make a point of saying my name loudly and often. She looked at the tablecloth, and I understood what she was doing. I understood it was an act of care, but it made me feel like a case study, like she had decided I needed visible accommodation rather than just being treated like everyone else, like my presence required effort from others in a way that other presences didn't. She paused. I think that's the thing people get wrong most often. They either ignore you or they compensate. And both of them say the same thing. You are different in a way that changes how I behave. What I always wanted was just someone who behaved exactly the same. He nodded slowly, not performing understanding, actually processing. I had a boyfriend once, she continued, and she wasn't sure why she was saying this, only that it wanted to be said. He told me he found it hard to go to restaurants with me because people stared. He said it made him uncomfortable. Not me. Him. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He should have sat beside you more, he said finally. It was such a simple thing to say, such an obvious thing. She had heard 100 more elaborate forms of comfort over the years, and none of them had landed the way those 7 words did. Quiet, without performance, just the plain truth of what the correct thing would have been. She felt something behind her eyes get warm, and she looked away for a moment, toward the stage where the MC was arranging papers. I almost didn't come tonight, she said. I know the feeling, he said. Rosie, who had been quietly drinking punch and watching the stage, turned to Vivian and asked with complete sincerity, Are you scared of people? Rosie Thomas began. It's okay, Vivian said. She looked at the girl's open face. Sometimes, she admitted. Not scared exactly. Just... She considered. Tired. Rosie nodded slowly, as though filing this away. Daddy gets tired too, she said. He says tired is okay, as long as you keep going. Thomas looked at his daughter. Something moved in his expression, quickly, and was contained. Across the room, a woman in a red dress was making her way toward their table. with the purposeful stride of someone who had decided something. Her name was Darlene Marsh. She ran a venture capital firm. Her photograph appeared in business magazines with some regularity. She was, by every external measure, successful, and she wore her success as armor, which meant any room she entered became a room in which social hierarchies required quick and visible enforcement. She stopped at their table. She was looking at Vivienne. "Are you here as someone's guest?" she asked. The question was technically neutral. The tone was not. Vivienne looked up. She had met Darlene March before different names, same grammar. "I am," she said. "Patricia Whitmore invited me." Darlene glanced at Thomas, then back. "You seem," she paused, choosing out of place. The table was quiet. "Are you here for attention?" Darlene asked. "I only ask because she's been sitting here," Thomas said. Darlene turned to him with the patient expression of someone interrupted by a child. "I beg your pardon? She's been sitting here," he said again. The same tone. Steady. "That's what she's been doing." Darlene smiled in a way that did not involve warmth. "I was speaking to her." "You were speaking at her," Thomas said. "There's a difference." A man at the adjacent table had stopped talking. Two women nearby had tilted their heads slightly. The unconscious movement of people triangulating a scene. Darlene addressed Vivienne directly, still smiling. "People like you always want sympathy. The look, the appearance, it draws attention, doesn't it? And some of us find that, Daddy." Rosie's voice was small and certain. "She's being mean." The word landed in the silence like a stone in water. Mean. 6 years old and absolutely correct. Thomas stood up. He was not a large man, not threatening in any physical sense, but there was something in the quality of his stillness when he rose that made the space around him change. He looked at Darlene Marsh without anger, which was somehow more uncomfortable than anger would have been. "No," he said. "People like you just need someone beneath them." The sentence moved through the room. Several nearby conversations stopped entirely. Darlene's expression shifted through several coordinates: surprise, offense, calculation, before settling on the defensive composure of someone who has not been spoken to this way in a very long time. "And who," she asked, her voice precisely controlled. "Exactly are you?" Thomas said nothing. He picked up Rosie's cup and handed it to her. He looked at Vivienne. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Just that. Not don't worry about her, or she's not worth it. Just, are you all right?" "Yes," Vivienne said. From the direction of the main entrance, a man in a dark blazer with a foundation lanyard was walking toward their table with a speed that suggested urgency. Behind him, 2 members of the event coordination team were following in the specific rapid walk of people who have just discovered something alarming. The man with the lanyard, whose name tag read Gerald Whitmore, Foundation Director, arrived slightly breathless and addressed Thomas with an expression that had abandoned its earlier ease and replaced it with something close to alarm. "Mr. Hadley, I had no idea you were already here. We didn't see your name at the check-in." "I came in with Rosie," Thomas said. "We were fine." Gerald Whitmore was the kind of man who became more agitated the more composed the person he was speaking to remained. Of course. We would have the table. We have a seat reserved at the main." "We're fine here," Thomas said. Gerald looked at the table. At Vivienne. At Darlene Marsh, who was still standing, and whose expression had begun its transition from offense to something more carefully managed. Thomas looked at Darlene. Was there something else? There was not. She left. Gerald Whitmore turned back to Thomas with the manner of a man who is managing several emotions at once. "Mr. Hadley, the announcement." "I know," Thomas said. "Give me 10 minutes." Gerald nodded rapidly and retreated. Vivienne had been watching this exchange. She looked at Thomas now with the attention of someone reassembling a picture they had thought they understood. "Who are you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I started a construction company at 22. Contract work. Nothing impressive." He turned his cup. "My wife got sick when Rosie was 2 years old. Pancreatic cancer. We didn't have the right insurance at the time. The treatment center, the one that might have helped her, told us the waiting period, the costs, the forms. You know how it goes. Vivienne said nothing. She was listening. Laura was 31, he said. She was a kindergarten teacher. She had this quality of making you feel like whatever you were doing was exactly right. Like you were sufficient, just enough. He paused. She would have loved tonight, in the way she loved complicated things. She would have found the good person in every difficult room and made a point of knowing their name by the end. A long pause. Rosie has her mouth, and her habit of staring at things she finds beautiful without being self-conscious about the staring. He looked at his daughter with the specific expression of a man who has found consolation and devastation in the same face every morning for 3 years. She died, he said, 9 months after the diagnosis. Rosie was 3. He said it without performance. Just stated. After that, I couldn't do contract work anymore. I sold the business, used the money to fund research on pediatric cancer treatment access. Then, other medical access issues. Rare diseases, conditions that got underfunded because they weren't profitable enough to attract private research money. He paused. It became a larger thing than I expected. The anonymous benefactor, Vivienne said quietly. I don't like events like this, he said. But the foundation does important work, and they asked me to be here in person for once. Rosie, who had been listening with the attentive patience of a child accustomed to adult conversations she was not entirely following, said, Daddy built a hospital. Part of a hospital, Thomas said. The whole pediatric wing, Rosie said firmly. Vivienne looked at him, this man in the not-new suit, with his polished shoes and his punch cup and his 6-year-old daughter who called hair moonlight, and she felt something shift in the architecture of the evening. Around the room, the knowledge was spreading the way news spread in enclosed spaces, quickly, quietly, in increments. The man who had been mocked by proximity, the man at the table with the strange woman, the man in the ordinary suit, Darlene Marsh, across the room, had gone the particular shade of pale that on a fair-complexioned person reads as something close to distress. Thomas looked at none of it. He was looking at Vivienne. They're announcing the humanitarian award in about 10 minutes, he said. I'm told the recipient this year did something extraordinary. A pause. You should stay. Before she could respond, the MC's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, we're ready to present the Foundation's annual Humanitarian Award. The recipient this year is someone whose work has directly changed the lives of over 400 children across 11 states. It is my honor to announce. The MC looked down at the card in his hand. Miss Vivienne Calloway. The silence was of a specific quality, not the silence of boredom, not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the name they expected. This was the silence of approximately 240 people recalibrating. Vivienne did not move for 3 full seconds. She looked at Thomas. He was looking back at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Not surprise, she thought, or not quite, and there was something in his eyes that looked like recognition, like he had known something about her before she'd confirmed it. Rosie was already applauding with the focused enthusiasm of someone who thinks clapping is one of the best human inventions. Vivienne stood. She did not know, precisely, what she looked like in that moment, pale and silver-haired in the warm light. In her dark green dress, rising from a table at the edge of the room, but she saw the faces turning, the expressions arriving, the slow reassembly of understanding in the eyes of people who had spent the last hour looking through her. She had founded the Luminary Foundation 4 years ago with the inheritance from her grandmother, an amount of money that would have bought her a very comfortable silence for a very long time. She had spent it instead on surgical costs for children with rare genetic conditions whose families couldn't afford the procedures, on research grants for albinism, associated visual impairments in underserved communities, on a network of support groups for parents whose children had conditions that medicine either couldn't fix or wouldn't prioritize because the patient populations were too small to be profitable. She had never done it for recognition. She had done it because she knew with the specific knowledge of someone who had inhabited the margins of every room she'd ever entered that being seen as a problem to be managed was a particular kind of suffering that compounded quietly, over years, into something very large and very hard to come back from. She had wanted to make it easier for the children who would grow up into rooms like this one, where chandeliers were warm and kind to everyone except them. She walked across the ballroom toward the stage. She felt the eyes, as she always did, but tonight the eyes were different. They were not looking away. She climbed the steps to the stage. The MC offered her the microphone with a slight bow. Behind her, on the screen, a photograph appeared. A 6-year-old girl with a rare chromosomal condition, sitting upright in a hospital bed in Chicago, holding a stuffed rabbit and grinning. Underneath the photograph, post, surgery, funded by the Luminary Foundation, March 2023. Then another, a boy in Atlanta, a girl in Phoenix, a set of twins in rural Vermont, who had been told by 3 hospitals that the necessary treatment was experimental and cost prohibitive and would require them to wait. Who had not had to wait? 412 children, 11 states. 4 years. Vivienne held the microphone and looked out at the room. She had not prepared remarks. This was not because she was unprepared in general. She was, in fact, a careful and organized person. But because she had not known until 40 minutes ago whether she was going to stay at this party long enough for anything to matter. She stood at the microphone. She said, "I almost didn't come tonight." The room was quiet, completely quiet. Even the servers had stilled. I got dressed, and I drove here, and I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes, and I thought about leaving. She looked at the microphone. I do that a lot. Not just to events, just in general. There's a specific calculation I do before I go anywhere. How many people will be there? Whether the lighting is the kind that makes my eyes look strange. Whether I'll be able to find somewhere to stand that doesn't make me the most visible thing in the room. She paused. It's exhausting, but it becomes automatic. She looked out at the room. 240 faces. I have albinism, she said. Some of you already know this because you were looking at me earlier tonight. And I know you were looking because I always know. I have always known. I learned to read it when I was very young, the half-second delay, and then the look away, or the sustained stare of someone trying to understand what they're seeing. She kept her voice level. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it because it's the reason this foundation exists. She looked at the photograph still showing on the screen, the girl in the hospital bed with the stuffed rabbit. Her name is Maisie, she said. She was 6 years old when the Luminary Foundation covered her surgery costs. She has a rare connective tissue disorder. Her parents had been told by 2 hospital systems that the procedure would cost more than their house and wasn't covered by their insurance, and that they should seek, and I'm quoting directly, comfort care, which means they should go home and manage her pain and expect her not to get better. Vivienne's voice was steady. She is 9 years old now. She goes to school. She has a best friend named Cordelia, and she is going to be a marine biologist. Someone in the room made a sound that was not quite a word. The children we've helped, Vivienne said, have conditions that don't trend, that don't have celebrity fundraisers, that fall into the gaps between what medicine considers worth investing in. She paused. I understand what it is to fall into that kind of gap. I understand what it means to be in a room full of people and to know that not one of them is going to walk over and sit down. She looked toward the east wall, toward the table where Thomas and Rosie were sitting. Tonight, one person did. She let the room hold that. He didn't know who I was. He didn't know about the foundation. He didn't sit down because of any calculation I can identify, except a simple one, that it was the right thing to do. She looked down at the award in her hands, a clear crystal piece, heavier than it looked. He brought his daughter with him, and his daughter looked at me and said my hair looked like moonlight. She heard, from somewhere in the middle of the room, a single, quiet sound. Not laughter, not applause. Something smaller and less composed. The foundation's work is about medicine, Vivienne said. But underneath the medicine, it's about this. about the specific harm of being made to feel that you don't belong in the room, that your body, your condition, your difference is a problem for the people around you rather than simply a fact of your existence. She paused. Children feel that, earlier than you'd think, and it shapes them in ways that are very, very hard to undo. The room was completely still. "I'm not good at speeches," she said. "I'm better at spreadsheets and grant applications and phone calls with hospital administrators at 7 in the morning." A brief, real smile. "So I'll just say this. I came tonight because a friend asked me to. I stayed because a stranger was kind to me. And I will keep doing this work because I know what it costs, not just financially, to fall through the gaps that polite society prefers not to look at." She set the crystal piece carefully on the podium. "Thank you," she said. The applause began before she had finished turning away from the microphone. The applause was still moving through the room when Darlene Marsh stood up. It was a visible act, visible because of the direction it moved, because of where she was positioned, because several people near her turned to watch as she crossed the ballroom toward the stage, with the particular posture of someone who has made a decision they have not yet fully committed to. Vivienne was descending the stage steps when Darlene reached her. "Miss Calloway." Vivienne looked at her. Darlene Marsh had spent 30 years in rooms like this one, and she had never once been on the wrong side of an introduction. She had been the woman who set the gradient the one other people calibrated against, whose opinion of your presence determined whether your presence was validated. It was a kind of power that required you to never examine it too closely, because the examination would reveal that it was entirely hollow, constructed from the fear of other people, and the very efficient conversion of that fear into performance. "I owe you an apology," Darlene said. Her voice was controlled, professionally managed. The apology was correct in its components, and insufficient in its texture. And Vivienne could hear both things simultaneously. "I was unkind," Darlene said. "What I said, the way I spoke to you, was inexcusable." Vivienne looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Carefully, not warmly. Darlene pressed on. "I want you to know what I said. It wasn't about you personally. I sometimes..." She paused. "I have a habit of establishing hierarchy," Vivienne said. Darlene stopped. "You have a habit of establishing hierarchy," Vivienne said. "Not unkindly, but precisely. I understand. It's a common habit. It usually works." She tilted her head. "It works better when the person you're establishing it against doesn't have a room full of people who now know exactly what you said." Darlene's jaw tightened fractionally. "I accept your apology," Vivienne said. "I don't require it to be larger than it is. But I do think," she paused, "that the apology you actually need to sit with tonight is not the one you're giving me." Darlene looked at her. "The apology you need," Vivienne said quietly, "is the one you give yourself. For a long time, before you figure out what part of this is habit and what part is something you actually believe." She moved past her. "Good night, Miss Marsh." From 3 tables away, Thomas had watched the exchange with his hand resting on the table and Rosie leaning against his arm, half asleep, done with the party in the decisive way of 6-year-olds. He had not intervened. He had simply watched. When Vivienne reached the table, she sat down. She was quiet for a moment. "That was remarkable," Thomas said. "The speech or the other part?" "Both." She looked at Rosie, who had given up on sitting upright, and was now sideways in her chair with her eyes at half-mast, the crystal punch cup still loosely in one hand. "She's going to fall asleep," Vivienne said. "She does this at about the 2-hour mark," he said. "Hits a wall, goes down like a tree." Vivienne smiled. From the stage, a new voice had begun speaking, someone from the foundation board, narrating the organization's history, recounting numbers and milestones that Vivienne knew better than anyone. She didn't listen. She looked at the tablecloth and thought about the parking garage and the 11 minutes she had sat there, and about how different the evening would have looked if she had simply driven home. Thomas poured the last of the punch into her cup. She looked at him. "Kindness shouldn't begin after embarrassment," he said quietly. She held the cup. "That's either the most cynical thing I've heard all night, or the most honest." "Both," he said. "Both," she agreed. Rosie was not asleep. She had been performing sleep. Vivian had suspected this, had noticed the slight tension in the small shoulders, the not quite relaxed grip on the cup, and precisely when the board member finished speaking and the orchestra began its first piece of the evening, Rosie sat up and looked at both of them with eyes that were completely awake. "Dancing," she said. This was both a statement and a proposal. "Rosie," Thomas said. "Dancing," Rosie said again, with the patient firmness of someone who has thought about this. She slid off her chair. She held out her hand to Vivienne. Vivienne looked at the small hand open, unambiguous, extended with zero calculation. "I should tell you," Vivienne said, "I'm a very average dancer." "That's okay," Rosie said. "Daddy is a terrible dancer." "Rosie," Thomas said. "He is," Rosie said, looking at Vivienne confidentially. "He does this thing with his elbows." Vivienne stood up. She took Rosie's hand. The three of them walked out onto the ballroom floor, and if 240 people watched them do it, then they watched something they had not been watching an hour earlier. Not spectacle, not the isolated woman at the east wall. Something else. Something that required a different vocabulary than the one the evening had started with. The orchestra was playing something slow and unhurried. Rosie, it turned out, had very strong opinions about how dancing should be done, and communicated these opinions via hand signals and directional tugs. Thomas danced the way Rosie had advertised, with a fundamental goodwill toward the activity that was not matched by any particular technical skill. And this made Vivienne laugh, actually laugh, the second time tonight. Around them, other couples were dancing. The board member was talking to Gerald Whitmore near the stage. A group of the champagne flute crowd had migrated to the far end of the room, and Vivienne was aware peripherally, not as the center of attention, just as information that several of them were looking at her now, with expressions that had nothing in common with what they'd worn an hour ago. She didn't spend long looking at them. She was watching Rosie, who had released both their hands and was now spinning in a private circle, arms out, eyes half closed, in the specific joy of a child who has decided that the floor is hers. Thomas stood beside Vivienne on the edge of Rosie's orbit. "She's extraordinary," Vivienne said. "She terrifies me," he said, which in tone was an expression of the deepest love she had ever heard expressed as mild alarm. "All the best ones do," Vivienne said. He turned to look at her with slight surprise, as if she'd said something he hadn't expected. And then he laughed, a quiet laugh, real, unguarded. And it changed his face, the way laughter changed all careful faces. Briefly, completely, revealing something underneath the composed exterior that was warmer and less certain and far more human than the surface he'd been wearing all evening. Vivienne thought, "Here is a person who has been careful for a long time. Not cold, not closed, but careful in the way of someone who has learned that certain openings cost more than they can afford, and has become expert at managing the edges." She recognized the quality. She had spent years cultivating it in herself. The difference was that his carefulness had a child inside it, a 6-year-old currently spinning in circles on a ballroom floor without a trace of it, and perhaps that was the thing that kept him from sealing entirely shut. The music moved. Rosie spun. The lights were warm. Vivienne looked at Thomas and said, "Why did you come sit beside me?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitation of someone composing a story. The quiet of someone deciding how much of the true thing to say. "Rosie asked me why everyone was ignoring you," he said. "And I couldn't give her an answer that would have been good enough for her." Vivienne waited. "She's 6, he said. Which means she's still at the age where she expects things to make sense, where she believes that if you ask a question that's simple enough and true enough, someone should be able to answer it." He looked at Rosie, still spinning, beginning to slow. The older you get, the more comfortable you get with letting bad things have no explanation, with deciding that the world's unkindness is just weather, something you navigate, not something you change. "I believe that," Vivienne said quietly. "I've believed it for a long time." "So did I," he said. "After Laura died," he stopped. "After my wife died, I got very good at accepting. At being a certain kind of sad that doesn't require any answers. Just keeps moving." He paused, and then Rosie started asking me questions. The music shifted. A new piece, slightly quicker. She watched me walk past people all the time, he said. People who needed something, not big things. Sometimes just acknowledgement. Just someone to look at them. He looked at his hands. She started asking me, "Why didn't you stop?" And at first I said, "Because we were busy," or "because I didn't know them," or "because it would have been strange." And she would look at me with this face. He made a small gesture, something between a smile and something harder. This completely honest, unimpressed face. As if to say, "Those aren't real reasons, Dad." Vivienne looked at Rosie, who had stopped spinning and was now sitting cross-legged on the ballroom floor, apparently having decided the floor was fine and she had earned a rest. "So I started stopping," Thomas said. "When she was with me, making myself stop, because she was watching me, and I understood the way you understand things when it's actually true that everything I did in front of her was teaching her something, whether I intended it to or not." He looked at Vivienne. "Tonight she pointed at you and asked me why everyone was ignoring you," he said. "And I couldn't answer her. And she was watching me." The sentence sat in the space between them. Vivienne felt something in her throat tighten. Not sadness, not quite, more like the feeling of something coming loose that had been held tight for a very long time. Years of calibrated detachment. Years of accepting that the loneliness of walking into rooms was just weather. Just something you navigated. Not something that required anyone to change course. "She was watching me," Thomas said again. "And I was watching you." And the only possible answer to her question was to cross the room. Vivienne looked down at the dance floor for a moment. "My grandmother," she said, after a pause, "left me enough money to disappear, to buy a house somewhere quiet and live a very comfortable, very isolated life, and never have to walk into another party and watch people decide not to look at me." She looked up. "I thought about it. I thought about it for a long time after she died." "What changed your mind?" Thomas asked. "A girl in a hospital in Denver," she said. 8 years old. Oculocutaneous albinism, same type as me, except with an associated kidney condition that required an expensive specialist procedure. Her parents had taken her to 4 hospitals. Every one of them had given them numbers that were not possible for a family with 2 jobs and no savings and a mortgage. She looked at the stage where her photograph still showed on the screen. "I sat with her for an afternoon when I was doing preliminary research on the foundation, and she showed me her drawings. She drew these enormous, detailed landscapes, mountains, forests, imaginary planets. She said she wanted to be an astronaut." Thomas was listening. "She looked exactly like me," Vivienne said. "The hair, the eyes, the way she smiled a little sideways, because she'd learned to preempt people staring at her teeth." A pause, and I thought, if no one sits beside her when she's 29 and alone at a gala, what does that cost her? Not just emotionally. What does it cost every child like her, in the years between 8 and 29, to be weather, to be something people navigate around? She was quiet. "It costs everything," she said, quietly. Over time, the orchestra played. Rosie had migrated from her cross-legged position on the floor and was now leaning against her father's leg with her eyes almost closed again. Thomas rested his hand on her head in the automatic way of parents, without looking down. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "I'm glad Rosie asked you the question," Vivienne said. She looked around the room once, a long, slow look, and registered it differently than she had an hour ago. The same chandeliers, the same marble floors, the same crowd in their autumn gowns and their polished conversations. But the room had a different texture now, the way a photograph looks different once you know the story behind it. She had been here before in this room, in rooms exactly like it, in every room she had ever entered with her particular constellation of features that made strangers recalibrate. She had always left these rooms before they changed. Tonight she had stayed long enough to discover that they could. She was not naive. She knew that the people who had murmured about her at the beginning of the evening would not wake up tomorrow transformed. That Darlene Marsh's apology, correct in its components and insufficient in its texture, would be processed into something manageable and filed away. That rooms like this one would keep running their social calculus, keep enforcing their invisible gradients, keep producing the particular silence that settled around anyone who looked too different to be easily incorporated. She knew all of this, but she also knew that Rosie was 6 years old and was learning, and that was not a small thing. Around them, the evening was softening. The sharp edges of the earlier hours, the hierarchies, the assessments, the small cruelties executed by people who had not yet been required to pay for them, were losing their definition in the warm orchestral light. It was not that the room had changed. People didn't change in the span of an evening. Not really, not in any lasting way. But something had been said in the room tonight that hadn't been there before. Something that the people who had been watching would carry with them in different amounts, to different ends when they left. A record, a witness account. The image of a woman who had sat alone at the east wall for 47 minutes, and a man who had crossed the room carrying 2 cups of punch, and a little girl who had looked at someone the rest of the room had looked through and offered her the only word that was actually true. "Moonlight," Rosie said, muffled against her father's jacket. "I'm not asleep." "I know," Thomas said. "I'm just resting my eyes." Of course. Vivienne watched Rosie press her forehead against the navy suit fabric and reach up, without looking, to find her father's hand. The lights of the Harrington Grand were warm on all of them. She thought about the parking garage. The 11 minutes. The engine running. The particular geometry of a decision that looks small from the outside and enormous from the inside. She was glad she had not driven home. "Will you bring her?" she asked Thomas. "To one of the foundation events. We do quarterly visits to some of the children. Maisie is in Chicago, and she would." She stopped. She would like Rosie. Thomas looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Not maybe or we'll see or let me check the calendar. Just yes. Just yes." The way simple, true things were said. The orchestra began a waltz. Rosie, who was definitely not asleep, made a sound that was possibly a hum. The ballroom was still full of people who had come here to be seen with the right people and leave with the right impressions. They were still networking, still managing their appearances, still doing the endless work of being witnessed in the right light by the right eyes. But in the center of the floor, a 6-year-old was humming to a waltz with her eyes closed. And a woman with silver hair was standing in the warm light of a room that had tried to ignore her and failed, and a quiet man was watching both of them with the specific expression of someone who has kept a promise not to an institution or an obligation, but to a child who was learning from him how to treat people. Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the one who teaches the room what humanity looks like. Sometimes she teaches it from a stage. Sometimes she teaches it from a table at the edge of the room, in a dark green dress, watching champagne flutes go around and around. Sometimes she teaches it just by staying. Rosie opened one eye. "Are we going to dance again?" she asked. Thomas looked at Vivienne. Vivienne held out her hand. "Yes," she said. And she meant it completely, without calculation, without the 11-minute pause in any parking garage. Just, yes.